already be on. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Landrum, and I'm the chair of the Department of Architectural Science. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here for this evening's conversation. And we will begin by acknowledging the land we gather on, the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Anishinaabe, including the Chippewas and Mississaugas of the Credit. So Indigenous perspectives remind us of the reciprocity of living beings in the land and of the land and water. And as an event focused on Toronto's waterfront, we may also acknowledge the waters that have shaped this place, the lost rivers and still thriving ravines, and the waterfronts that preceded the one we see today. For as many of you likely know, the water's edge of Lake Ontario was once the ridge 2 kilometers north of Davenport Road, Getty Onagamig, an Ojibwe portage route along the shore of the great glacial Lake Iroquois. So as we contemplate Toronto's waterfront, we may recall the previous shorelines, the First Nations who walked them, and the waters of memory and forgetfulness that have shaped this place for centuries. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for shaping this evening's conversation, Elsa Lam. Elsa is the editor-in-chief of Canadian Architect magazine, a role she has held since 2012, after earning 3 architectural degrees studying at Waterloo McGill and Columbia University in New York City. With Canadian Architect, Elsa has elevated the conversation on architecture with critical commentary, visionary curation, and bold editorials. She raises voices of new authors, opens space for dialogue on pressing issues, and speaks truth to power. Her recent editorials on the facts of Ontario Science Centre closure being a recent case in point. So Elsa is a writer, a teacher, an advocate, a public intellectual. Her work is driven by a love of language, a belief in the power of well-written and expertly researched articles to improve the built environment and enhance public understanding of the field, and also by an excitement for connecting passionate architectural experts to generate new ideas and drive change. So thank you, Elsa, for lending your passion and expertise to the conversation tonight, and I'll turn things over to you to introduce the speakers.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Lisa. So we've met Stephen Evans in the lobby, but as you know, he's a documentary photographer who's been based in Toronto and has focused his work on the city. He's exhibited and published internationally and features in various public and private collections. And I'll do another plug for his book, which you should pick up a copy of if you don't have one already. It's an extraordinary document about Ontario Place and the state of it that no longer exists today. John Lawrence is a Toronto journalist and editor. He writes about urban affairs, planning, local history, climate, and all things urban for Toronto media, including The Star, The Globe and Mail, Spacing, and Canadian Architect sometimes too. So he is a senior editor at Spacing, and he's the author of 5 books, including No Jews Live Here, a memoir, published last year by Coach House. And Marco Polo, who many of you know already, is a professor here at the Department of Architectural Science at TMU. He's a former editor of Canadian Architect magazine and has contributed to numerous publications and exhibitions on modern and contemporary Canadian architecture. So thank you, 3 of you. So I want to start with a little bit of a show of hands in this room. So raise your hand if you've been to the Toronto waterfront. Okay, great. Okay, now keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. Okay, now think about the first time that you were there. Was it, keep your hand up if it was 1 year ago or more. Okay, the first time. Okay, or more. Yeah, okay. So keep your hand up if it was 5 years ago or more. Okay. 10 years. Okay. 15 years. 20-ish. Okay. 30 years. Okay. 40 years. 50. Hey, this is pretty amazing. You have the last one standing here. Okay, including some people on the panel. That's great. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so I'll start opening the panel with a discussion, a kind of question of what each of you, what your earliest memory of the Toronto waterfront was, and a little bit on how it's changed since then. Do you want to start, Stephen?
Is this on? Yep. Um, one of my distinct memories was arriving at the age of 13, arriving at Toronto for the first time, driving across the Gardiner Expressway and seeing what to me was heaven. The harbor on one side, on the lake, huge boats, all the activity that was going on below me on the south side of the Gardiner, and on the north side, that sea of tracks, of train tracks that just kind of edged up to what at that time were the 3 or 4 major buildings in the city, which I think was the CIBC North Tower, the Royal York, the Mies buildings, and I think the CIBC Tower was up at that point. I can't quite remember, but it was a little bit like the Wizard of Oz for me. Just seeing Oz off in the distance, cuddling up to these railroad tracks. It was just an amazing scene for a 13-year-old kid to see.
So remarkably similar. It was my first visit to Toronto, and I think it was 1983. I was coming in on the Gardiner and going by the waterfront. It was the early days of the transformation of the waterfront from an industrial site into what it's become. And my most distinct visual memory was seeing one of the silos in the process of demolition and seeing this fantastic sort of spider web of rebar with chunks of concrete still stuck to it. And I thought, this is like an industrial utopian wet dream. It was really quite extraordinary. So that was a very strong image of what the waterfront was and how it was transitioning.
So I grew up in Toronto, and so I'm going to offer 2 memories. One is like a little kid memory. We used to get taken down to the Toronto Islands. I'm almost 100% certain that my mother drove down there. And for those of you who can remember what the geography of that part of the city was, there was lots of parking. And you know how little kids can sort of focus in on one particular thing. And I remember the strands of algae that would wave off those big tires that were the bumpers on the ferry. And, in those days, right, the water stank, and those things look kind of gross. And so there was sort of a gross quality. So I remember that. And the other memory is sort of is in 1977, when the CN Tower was being built, maybe it was 1976. This quite an interesting media stunt where a giant helicopter called the Sikorsky helicopter was going to lower the tip of the CN Tower onto the thing, right? And there was a lot of media attention to this. Before they did that, they left this giant sort of tube of steel somewhere close to the construction site. I don't remember where. And you could sign it. So, so we were taken down. And so my signature is actually on the inside of that thing. And then like a year or 2 later, and this is transitioning from a little kid memory to a teenager memory. I was in grade 8 in French immersion. We had a class full of kids from Quebec City, did not speak a word of English. And we took them on, my teacher took them on a field trip up to the CN Tower, which was a thing. And I remember, again, sort of like the snapshot memory of being dropped off near the foot of the bridge, which is now over the 400 leading to Weber's hamburger joint, where we were dropped off in a school bus with all these kids who didn't speak any English, waiting to go up in the CN Tower. And at the time, you had to go, that bridge existed because you had to cross all these railroad tracks, and there was nothing else there. It was just this tower. So that's what I remember.
Stephen, so you've watched this waterfront evolve over many decades. So I'm curious, you know, why this project and why now? Why now? Why not, 20 years ago or what is it about this moment?
It's a good question, and a little bit complex. One simplistic answer is that I basically downsized my business, and I have time. I knew that doing this project was going to take a lot of time, and so the timing for it has something to do with that fact. It also has to do with the fact that Ontario Place and what the outcome of Ontario Place was really alerted me to the fragility of the waterfront in terms of the politics, in terms of development. It made me concerned. I've been watching it change. You know, the city is a big city. Change is very much a part of what makes a city, but some of the change has been kind of notably good, and some of it has been notably complicated. And so it just seemed that now, particularly with the housing crisis and the need for more housing, it seemed to me to be a good time to spend more time wandering around, trying to see the inner seams of the lakeshore, particularly the harbor area. That's really where I've concentrated the work.
Yeah, and I'll circle back to politics in a minute. But I'm wondering, how did you define those kind of boundaries for the work?
Again, the practical answer is I'm getting old and have only so much in me to try and describe an area. I did think at one point of going as far as the railway tracks, but it just was going to be way too complex. And I think there was enough for me to do in the relatively confined area that I've chosen. Working from the lakeshore up to the Gardiner Expressway as kind of hard borders, and on the west side going as far as Ontario Place, a little bit further than Ontario Place, and then on the east side. That edge was really defined by the new project going on down there, Bitasagi Park and so on. That project is project unto itself, and in fact is being photographed by two other photographers quite extensively. So it seemed like a good breaking point right there. So from Cherry Street over to Ontario Place was basically the inner harbor of the city.
Yeah, well, there's certainly so much richness in that section that's captured in these photographs. It's like amazing the diversity of spaces that are pictured here. Yeah. So I promise to circle a little bit back to politics, and I'm wondering maybe if I could pick your brain, John, as the urban geographer kind of on the panel. If you could offer maybe a bit of a primer on the urban history and kind of political history of the development that we're seeing unfolding, in these photos. And
okay, so I think the most important thing to know is that the waterfront isn't natural. It's man-made. It's, really anything south of Front Street is constructed from landfill. And I always say that, the best way to think about that is that there are a lot of basements in Toronto and they were all filled with soil, and, it got dumped there. And years ago when I started writing about like the city and the waterfront, I ended up talking to a guy who I'm sure many of you know, John Van Nostrand, who's an architect. And he said something to me which was super perceptive, which is that because the land in the waterfront area, and we're talking about the central waterfront and also the Portlands, which dates back to 1912, is all constructed, it's man-made, it's for commercial purposes. It's got a competitiveness baked into it, right? There were different owners, and they had different aspirations. The land changed hands, it changed shape. And so that dynamic is still quite visible in the way the waterfront is developed. So just to very quickly run through, Toronto became an industrial city in the sort of second half of the 19th century. A lot of that lake fill, which had originally been wharves, became, railway lines. The railway lines stretched further and further out. There were other wharves, industrial buildings, and it was for many, many years an industrial waterfront. It was not a place to recreate. It was not a place to visit. It was a place to work. And it was a place to work if you were, working class person. And so that, that kind of exists for quite a long time, till about the 70s when the railways, CP and CN, who by then consolidated, were kind of realizing that they had way too much real estate. And so they eventually created this joint real estate company called Marathon Realty. And they wanted to essentially develop a lot of that railway land and set in motion like a lengthy and complicated and contentious process for selling off the land, for planning it, for developing it, intensifying it. And this was, for a long time, in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, you could see there was this collision of ideas and aspirations and profit motives and all sorts of stuff going on there. And then one important thing happened in the mid 1980s was that at the water's edge, there was this pretty dubious kind of development activity that was going on. A lot of it was being done kind of in the dark. There were deals that were cooked up. City council was sort of not being very forthcoming about this. And eventually, because the federal government at the time owned a lot of land around Waterfront and Harborfront, the prime minister said, it was Brian Mulroney, said, we're going to kind of shut this down, establish a royal commission on the future of Toronto's waterfront. And it would be led by David Crombie, who at the time was kind of wallowing in a ministry that he hated. And he was the former mayor of the city. And that set in motion a process of, many years of reflection on what is the city's relationship to the waterfront, and why is the waterfront so polluted? Coming back to my memory of it, stinking water. How do we integrate the desire for a modern city, a 20th century city, to be near water, but water that's not gross and water that's usable in lots of different ways? And that led to the Toronto Waterfront Revitalization Committee and eventually to Waterfront Toronto, which was tasked with planning a lot of the development and intensification, basically from the Portlands right across the waterfront. And what you see in Steve's pictures is the sort of half-finished story of the process that begins in the mid 1980s, which is this complicated, contentious conversation about what to do with this land. But if you step way back, what you see there is that the city, which had really didn't go beyond Front Street, right? There was a wall, the Royal York, just advances, boom, 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 as close to the water as it can get. And that process is ongoing. And it's not tidy at all. And it doesn't always produce good results, which I think is one of the things that you depict in this story. So just the last point I'll make, what Steve's pictures show is a play at 5-act play in Act 3, right? That's that's where we are.
Nice. Marco, I'm wondering if you can, thank you, John. That was really helpful. And Marco, I'm wondering if you could tackle from an architectural history kind of perspective, what you're seeing in the waterfront and in Steve's photos.
Oh, okay.
Just in a minute or two, a second or two.
40 years of development. Well, as John pointed out, there was a period in the early years of the development of the waterfront where we saw a lot of pretty dubious projects happening, quite undistinguished. There were a few very important projects that I recall being important catalysts for generating interest in the waterfront and starting to spur a new wave of development. And one of the first that comes to mind was the adaptive reuse of the terminal warehouse, which became Queens Quay Terminal by Zeidler Partnership. And if I'm remembering correctly, because this goes back a long time now, it's 40-ish years, I believe it won a Governor General's Award. It was a very highly regarded building. And so that made an important splash on the waterfront. Sorry for that bad pun. But it was an important catalyst then for further potential development on the waterfront. It was followed not too long after by again an important adaptive reuse project, the power plant, which was a power plant converted into an art gallery. That was by Let Smith Architects. And then there was just adjacent to that the York Quay Center with its late lamented skating rink. So that became a really important hub in the early years of the waterfront redevelopment. And like I said, that was followed by a period of not very distinguished residential projects, which led to some of the issues that John described. The forming of these commissions and trying to bring some more structure to the processes, so transparency as well to the processes of the waterfront. One of the challenges with the waterfront has always been this tension between public versus private, built form versus open space. That continues. That's not done. That's an ongoing sort of tension that's there. But certainly in recent years, the quality of design on the waterfront has much improved, both in terms of built form and open space. What did I want to say? Something on my mind that just kind of slipped. One thing that's interesting, I think, about our waterfront that's maybe different from other waterfronts is we haven't, to date, created a kind of singular iconic project. For example, I'm thinking of the Elbe Philharmonie in Hamburg, which kind of becomes such a kind of centripetal force, right? It's an extraordinary building. You can see it from many parts of the city as you approach the waterfront, and it becomes such a singular image of the waterfront. Now, we haven't gone that route. We may yet. If we're only in Act 3, we don't know what's coming next. But it's more a kind of collection of incremental interventions, I would say. There's a few buildings now that I think start to stand out a bit more. The recently completed Aqua Luna by 3XN, I think is unusual in the context of the sort of the aesthetic of our waterfront. The bridges by Wilkinson Eyrie in the Eastern Portlands are pretty extraordinary. And, these are all projects that are being recognized, certainly. So I would say generally the quality has improved a lot in recent years. We're bringing in a lot more sort of outside voices to the waterfront that maybe are bringing a fresh energy to the way we think about the waterfront in Toronto, different from maybe what we've done before. And I would also say that I think, many of the high points on the waterfront are the open spaces, the green spaces, and in particular, the newly opened Bidasige Park is I don't really know how to describe it. Having seen the evolution of that site over many years, and knowing what it was just 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, it's kind of miraculous.
Yeah, totally echo that. It's amazing. If you haven't gone to see it, then go this weekend when there's going to be an extraordinary artwork happening there. Yeah. Okay. Stephen, your turn in the line here. Your expertise on the waterfront really, comes from this deep practice of spending, hours and days and weeks and months photographing it. So I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit on what's the feeling of these places and how has that changed over time? Or another way to put it, like what's it like to photograph in this site? The series of sites, I should say.
It offers its challenges physically, but the change has been dramatic over the past 40 years, and I've gotten to see it go from tank farms to condominiums, I'm quite nostalgic about it. So I develop an opinion pretty quickly about what I think about these projects. It doesn't necessarily come from an expertise. I'm not an urban planner. I'm not an architect, but I have spent a lot of time climbing around, trying to sort it out, trying to understand it, trying to see things that perhaps people don't really pay attention to down there. I mentioned earlier the inner seams of the place. So I hope that, that enthusiasm to kind of dig a little deeper and a little off the beaten path shows up in those photographs.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to circle back to something that the three of you I think have pointed to both on this panel and also in the short essays that are in that brochure, which is this kind of gap between the ideals that might have driven the waterfront development at various points in time. Certainly not in the mid 80s, but maybe following that. And then the reality on the ground. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more, if anyone wants to say a bit more about that.
So I think that the redevelopment of the waterfront begins quite idealistically, and I think on a fairly narrow base of inputs, and then a lot of things happen. A lot of capital pours in there. There are more ideas about the public realm from agencies like Waterfront Toronto, and I think that I think that there's this tension between public space and private space, which exists everywhere in the city. Like really, that's what cities are about, is that there are private spaces and there are public spaces and they bump up against each other and we use both of them. And that's the nature of urban living. And the thing about the waterfront, that area of the waterfront, is that it's happening kind of in real time. It's happening quickly, but in city time. And the inputs is to, what determines public space have become broader, right? Like there are all sorts of constituency groups that stakeholder groups that didn't exist when it was an industrial waterfront and when the York Center was built. They're rowing clubs, they're walking clubs, they're the sports teams that use the Scotiabank Arena and are interested in the space, the Raptors space, also a public space, but sort of private space as well. And so the conversation about what is public gets wider, but it's also bumps up against this problem that Steve talks about in his book about Ontario Place, which is that there are also forces, these powerful forces of capital that can eradicate public space and turn it into something quite privatized. And I think that I'm glad that Waterfront Toronto exists because it elevates this conversation about public space and the nature of public space. I just will quickly say that one of the shortcomings of the waterfront, the entire waterfront, is that the private development has happened way faster than infrastructure, especially transit infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure, which is just lagged in a terrible way. And so there are places where it feels kind of very discontinuous. And when that part happens, I think we'll see more interesting things happening in public space, which are, the ideas that come out of Waterfront Toronto.
Well, so many forces at play, and we've seen some schemes that have come and gone, and unrealized. Maybe some, fortunately so. Others maybe disappointingly so. And there's just so many different cycles. Cycles of governance, cycles of economy, and I think John's point about transit and pedestrian infrastructure lagging is very important because I think that continues to be an issue. Last week, we took our students in our first year master's studio on a bicycle tour of the waterfront. And that's one of the sort of glaring issues when you are accessing the waterfront, the challenges of accessing it. And we were all, able-bodied, bicycle riding people who, managed just fine, but that's not true for everybody. So access to the waterfront, I think, remains a challenge. Part of it is the legacy of the industrial uses there, and of course the infrastructure of the railways and the Gardiner and so forth. And we're starting to knit some of that back into the city. There are some very positive moves in that direction, but there's still, I think, some challenges with just getting people to the waterfront. In terms of sort of infrastructure lagging. There's also, I think, an interesting new direction that we're seeing that in some kinds of infrastructure are now preceding development. And I think of Leslie Lookout Park and of course the new Bidasige Park, which we've already mentioned. They're the first interventions in these areas, setting the tone for whatever comes next. And I think that's a very positive move. Now, we may be entering a phase where it takes a long time for whatever comes next to show up. And I think for a long time, it looked like condo construction boom was going to go on forever. And now we see it, it's not going to. It's certainly going to slow down. So what does that mean for some of those surrounding lands, adjacent to these new park infrastructures? It may be a really opportune moment to rethink how we want to approach some of these sites. We don't have to necessarily continue on the template that we've been using. And this is what happened, for example, with one of the projects that didn't go forward some 25 years ago, which was a Taratiri. And then that eventually became something else. We saw the sidewalk labs blow up. So there's an opportunity for that to become something else. And now that we're facing potentially this kind of slowdown in development, that might be another opportunity to think about how do we leverage the infrastructure that we've just built to create something really remarkable.
I think one of the big challenges in amongst all of this discussion is the creation of communities. And that's a really enormous challenge down there with the kind of disparate landscape that's been created, with the issues of housing and homelessness. We started with a place that wasn't a community per se, and we're now trying to create communities. And there's a lot of advertising that's gone into selling the ideas about what these communities are and who they're for. And I'm seeing bits and pieces of these things coming together, for example, the parks. But it is an enormous challenge to really rise to the occasion of trying to make a pluralistic, a democratic, a really vibrant community out of this vast geography. It's really a very big project.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, I see the various encampments in your photos, as well as tents under highway ramps. And of course, those of us who have followed the waterfront for longer than that will remember Tent City on the Terry lands. So there's that whole history of the waterfront as well. Yeah, that's hinted at. This kind of line makes me want to push you guys a little bit further to speculate a little bit on, if you're talking about we're in Act 3, what are some possibilities for Act 4 and 5 that you see? What are some of the maybe, it could be framed in terms of what are the biggest, you've mentioned some big challenges, what are some possible resolutions maybe that could take us in a progressive direction? Sure, you've got the mic. Go for it. Yeah.
One of the things I've been thinking about is retail and what's going on in retail right now down at the waterfront, which strikes me as being overly franchised. And in terms of referring to this idea of community, I think to try and deal with retail is a big question right now. The internet has changed that environment entirely. How do we make these communities work? Part of it is to have a street life, and to, I guess one of my thoughts has been the idea of, if we're going to kind of supplement people, to support people to get housing, maybe we should be supporting people to get into retail, create galleries, create spaces that people, retail enterprises that people can get into, and that can really animate these places and help turn them into communities. So the idea of creating some kind of way of particularly with new developments, somehow encouraging retailers, small businesses to get in, help support them through the years where there's so much construction going on, they can't really become viable. And they've got to kind of wade their way through that. They're at a real disadvantage under those circumstances. So let's help support them and help bring some of these ideas closer to the waterfront than they are right now.
When you mention that, Stephen, it makes me think that a lot of it then is related to issues of scale and grain, because a lot of recent development is delivering retail, but it's delivering a certain kind of retail of a certain scale that only seems to be accessible to large chains. And I understand that having a single large tenant is easier than having many small ones, and so on and so forth. But it's a very important situation in terms of in order to encourage what you're talking about. There's a scale shift, I think, that has to happen, and an acceptance or a desire to create this finer grain. The other thing that I think we can be looking at, and you asked me earlier, Elsa, to talk about this from a kind of architectural historical perspective, so I'll go there. But if you look at the history of Toronto, especially in the sort of latter half of the last century, there was a lot of really interesting experimentation going on in terms of housing. A lot of new models challenging conventional wisdom. And we learned a lot of really good lessons, I think, in that period that we seem to have forgotten. We could be mining our own history, looking at models that worked very well in a certain context. And I understand that the context changes and economies change and so forth. But I don't think we should disregard that history. I think we should be looking back at some of the models. I'm thinking of, just to be very general, the St. Lawrence model. There are lessons there that we seem to have forgotten that I think we could be going back to. And maybe there's opportunity if there is a pause in the current condo wave, maybe it's an opportunity to think about going back and learning, not replicating, but learning from those models.
I just want to expand on that point and stress it a little bit, which is that this slowdown, like the basically the comatose state of the condo industry, is such a gift for city building in the city, right? And people make the mistake of thinking that in 2 or 3 years, those pre-sales will sort of start in again, and we'll get those 45-story towers. It's not going to work that way. It's going to take a long time to build back. And I think that the City of Toronto's planners, the people at Waterfront Toronto, really have an opportunity to do some of these things that you've talked about, and and then also experiment. Like, this is one of the problems of the vernacular high-rise architecture in Toronto over the last 15 years, is that it's very uniform. There's the podium, there's retail. The retail spaces get bigger because they're leased out to big brokers. There's some cosmetic features on the towers, but basically they're a very generic product. And there are lots of different ways of developing density. There's definitely public sector, government interest in more affordable housing. And so, you think, okay, well, we talk about that Philharmonic Hall in Hamburg, right? In Hafen City, which, so go look it up if you don't know it. It's like a crazy building. And maybe what we do is we say, okay, well, let's think about, the Portlands, and think about using that as a platform to experiment with different forms that, that people know work. I'll give like one really interesting example. There's a firm that I've written about that's building a kind of a European style rental apartment building in the middle of Scarborough on a former it was a strip mall site. And it's basically a courtyard building. It's got a courtyard in the middle. It's got, instead of like the long, narrow hallways, it's got, it's single egress, single loaded hallways, right? So you can get cross draft, and it's just a completely different form. And when the developers brought this to the city, they were like, what the hell is this? It's like, well, in Europe, there are thousands of these buildings. You can do this. And so maybe that's the way we take Waterfront Toronto and kind of backfill the architectural diversity into the space, right? Because I mean that's what cities are, right? The cities are, so much of cities are like background buildings, this and that, and they're nothing special, but in the aggregate they make something interesting. But what we're missing down there is this more fine-grained architecture, and I think your idea is just spot on.
Right. I'm going to do one last panel for the group or question for the group and then open it up to questions from the audience. So prepare your questions. Just to circle back to the show and the photographs, I want to close out this section by asking maybe if each of you could name, if there's one particular photograph that caught your eye or caught you by surprise, or that maybe touches on encapsulates some of these themes that we've been talking about. And then I'll open it up for questions from the floor. Sure. Yeah, you get to weigh on. Of course, Steve, I'd love to hear from you too.
Well, there's actually a couple I'd like to mention, if I could. One is the picture taken at the CNE bandshell with the fans, which I think is just really delightful. And it's one of those strange, it's a strange image for me also because I've been by that site on a few occasions recently, and sometimes the fans are there and sometimes they're not. So now I'm doubly convinced that they're animate and they're kind of moving back and forth in that space. Yeah. But the one that really stood out for me more than any of the others is the one with the it's the one of the rose garden on the south edge of the CNE grounds with the Angel of Peace from the I guess it's the Shriner's Peace Fountain. Is that what it's called? The Shrine Peace Fountain. And it's juxtaposed with the with the wind turbine. We see the kind of the garden, the planted garden, which is clearly past its prime. We see the shape of the bandshell in the background. So there's a lot of complex forms in it, but I think one of the things I really like about it is it captures these different stages of development in that particular spot. Like the Shrine Fountain is almost 100 years old, and it captures a certain moment in the city's history. And the fact that it was built by the Shriners tells you something about the social history of the city in the 1930s. And then we have the wind turbine, which I think dates from the early part of the 21st century. But there's just something about that kind of juxtaposition of elements. And then just aesthetically, it's a striking piece.
So I'll mention sort of a category of pictures and then one particular one. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about this exhibition is that there aren't a lot of people in these photographs, and it does strike me that the people feel dwarfed against this very big geography, right? These big objects like the highway and these huge buildings. And I think that that's like the Act 3 part, because it's like thinking about like what was Fifth Avenue like in the 1890s, the 1910s, when those old sort of those old 6 or 7 story buildings were being torn down and these much bigger ones were being put up. And initially, I'm sure it was just a dog's breakfast, and then the people come, right? And so the people will come, and because there's a lot of density down there. So that's one thing that struck me. The other one was this like striking picture of, I think it's 1 York Street, is it the, with the sort of the razor's edge. So that spot, just to contextualize it, I think in the 80s or 90s, I went to see a hockey game at Maple Leaf Gardens with a buddy of mine, and I parked my mother's car on a street nearby, got out of the hockey game, no car to be seen. It's like shit. It was towed, right? And that site is where the cops took cars to be impounded, right? So you had to go to Union Station, walk under like this terrible thing, and then there was like a little window, and you have to beg for your car back and give them like an outrageous amount of money. And now it's this, and it's like it just that, and that wasn't, I mean, it wasn't a long time, but it's a short time in city time, and it's this like striking building, right? So that's striking.
I think one of the photographs that I think tells a bit about my feeling about the project is the one of the music garden, where as you approach it, you think you're looking at a garden, but in fact, some of those poppies and chrysanthemums are actually people. And as you get closer and closer, there's this audience and profile. And I'm particularly favorable to the music garden. I think it's just a lovely, lovely project, and I find it very peaceful and very enjoyable to be at on a Thursday or Friday afternoon in the summer. Musicians will just plop down and start playing guitars, start playing a musical instrument. There was one performer I saw there that was playing 7 musical instruments, and it was spectacular. I mean, these are really gifted people too, and people were coming from everywhere. They were just coming from the street, they were coming from the boardwalks and so on, and just assembling on the side of this hill. And many of them would bring bottles of wine and blankets, and they'd settle in. There were people doing drawings, and it was just an incredible, wonderful scene in the middle of this enormous place, and it was free. Oh, I'm sorry, I've lost it, but it was influenced by Yo-Yo Ma, and in collaboration with a New York firm. Yeah, yeah, and it's just a really lyrical place to go, and certainly one of the kind of the best places that, or one of the most important places that I like to go, just to get away from. I mean, even with the airplanes taking off in the background, you're able to kind of get that out of the way and listen to this music and watch people and see how the waterfront can be at its best. So.
And as promised, I'll open the floor. I'd like to prioritize if there's some students that have questions to start. Don't be shy. You can direct a question to the panel, or if there's one particular panelist. You're not a student, Chris, but that's okay. You're a student at heart.
I can channel Jakobus Vilna, who was our first year professor, who was like 90 or something, and he always said, "I'm senior first year student in architecture." I would like to ask a non-political question, if that's okay. So everyone in this room, pretty much, as part of their practice, walks around in the world looking at it hard to try and learn from it, and it's more and more mediated as time passes. And it strikes me, Stephen, that you have been pursuing an art that is by definition a mediated art. There's always a piece of glass of some kind between you and what you're looking at and trying to capture. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that has influenced your relationship to the landscape, both the natural and the man-made landscape, or human-made landscape, sorry. And whether there are any, because you're taking these photographs and then you're conveying something extraordinary to all of us through them. So clearly that mediation is working for you. So so maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe some lessons that you could, little kernels of wisdom you could pass on to the rest of us.
I'm not particularly book literate. I use the camera to learn about the world. So what you're seeing is the process that I go through to find out about how the world works. And every one of these photographs is a thread to information for me. It's a source of learning about a place. And I think that's, I think that's the answer to your question. It's the glass is there. I've been taking pictures for a very long time. Being an architectural photographer, I tend to be very precise in the way that I use the camera. And so I tend to see shapes and forms and light very specifically in a very specific way. I try to open my mind to other ways of doing it, but fundamentally the important part of it for me is that what's out there is for me to learn something about. Keep in mind that many of these photographs are chosen out of thousands of exposures. So if you've turned around, there are 175 more pictures being projected on the wall behind, or just over the doorway. So it's a hard process to sort through all of those things when you're taking that many pictures. And I think there are a few photographers in here who would agree with me. But they're all threads. They're all a way for me to connect to information and to dig further and to understand the world that much better. And I hope in doing that, people are kind of coming along for the ride.
Hi, thanks so much for the panel discussion. My question, something that struck me when I was looking at all the photographs is that like just I started me thinking about the seasonality. There's those winter photos. And I was just wondering if you have any reflections on the waterfront in the winter. I know that there was that loss of that skating rink, and just like yeah, I don't know, reflections on the space in the winter. Yeah.
Very, very deliberate decision on my part, because I think the tendency for people is to kind of understand the waterfront as being a kind of springtime, summertime place. And so part of that discovery of learning more about it is taking the risk to go out in bad weather. In some cases, in the middle of a snowstorm, there is a picture taken in the middle of a snowstorm, raining in the winter. It's a place that has a personality that changes all the time, and that weather condition is one that I don't think people really understand and recognize. It's problematic too for the waterfront. How do we deal with those conditions? It's very easy for people to lock themselves into these apartment buildings if we don't have enough for people to really take advantage of down at street level. So it was important to me to show that condition and introduce people to the possibilities, the beauty of it in some cases, and in other cases, the problems that it might present for people. Hope that helps.
Hi, I had a question about waterfront and spaces that are publicly accessible but privately owned and leased, because, if this current provincial government gets its way, there's a huge number of acres which are being advertised as such, leased to a private company for 95 years, yet they're said to be publicly accessible green space. So my question is, are there any examples of, huge swaths of outdoor spaces on waterfronts and other areas, and how have they functioned?
Sorry.
John, do you know anything about that?
Trying to think. So I think the answer to your last question is that there aren't really big privately owned but quote publicly accessible spaces. The city of Toronto has sort of fallen in love with this idea of POPs, privately owned public spaces, which I personally am not a big fan of. I think it's kind of a way of showing that there's, that the city is paying attention to the public realm without actually kind of engaging with the problem of, of the fact that they are private spaces, right? And in some cases, these are private spaces that are essentially the front entrance of a condo. And you have questions about access and all of that stuff. I think you're referring to the Ontario Place, Schlemazel, and it really remains to be seen. Injecting my editorial opinion, remains to be seen whether that thing is going to get built. It remains to be seen what public means. And my own view is that public will be a kind of a conditioned public because the Therme is paying for a lot of that public space, and they will eventually recognize that there are, there are activities that they can stage on that public space, and then they'll want to make use of it. So, I also was talking about this man-made island off the west side of New York, which was who's the philanthropist who built that? And that Barry Diller. And my wife and I went there. I mean, I found it kind of underwhelming. It's kind of gimmicky. It's like this big, it's hard to describe. It's this thing on stilts, and it's this sort of, I don't know. I'm not good at describing architecture, but it feels kind of gimmicky.
So a couple of projects come to mind, but they're quite different from what we're anticipating for Ontario Place. They're waterfront projects. There's the Opera House in Oslo, where the public can access the roof of the building as a public space without having to enter and pay admission to the building. And then there's the Museum of Science in Amsterdam by Renzo Piano, which has a similar condition. You can occupy the roof as the public. It's quite a nice space. It's one of the highest points in the city where you can get a view, and you can do this all without the paid admission to actually enter the building. So they're more modest in scale, but it's a similar kind of idea.
I'm coming.
There's an awful lot of hand-wringing going on nowadays about, and we see articles from time to time about how our waterfront is a failure. And looking enviously, why can't we be like Copenhagen? Why can't we be like Sydney? Why can't we be like, pick your city? And I think, Stephen, when I saw the photographs, to me, it revealed a kind of particular beauty, a strange beauty about our waterfront. And I've worked on a lot of waterfront cities around the world, and every city for me has a particularity. And I wonder if you could all comment on what makes our waterfront particularly Toronto-like, as opposed to all those others.
I guess in part, it's fragmentary nature. There isn't a single vision. It's kind of built up of incremental decisions, which sometimes feels that's how the city operates. There's a lot of one-offs without a lot of coordination between different projects and different ways of thinking about the city. So that makes it, to some extent, kind of Toronto, as does the kind of mix of uses, right? The fact that you've got this artificial beach facing a sugar factory. So there's a kind of, again, that kind of fragmentary quality about it. Interesting, the comment about the city, or the waterfront being a failure. I think if we go back to John's comment about Act 3, I would say it's a work in progress. I think if it had continued along the lines that we were seeing it taking in the 80s, then maybe, yes, we could say that with more conviction. But based on some of the stuff that has been happening more recently, I would say that there's a lot of hope.
So you could make an argument that the construction of the TD Bank towers marks the beginning of modern Toronto, right? And the skyline of waterfront, the skyline of the city at that point was the Royal York, which is the tallest building in the British Empire, as Toronto like to tell itself. And then suddenly there were these incredible towers by Mies van der Rohe. And then a little bit later, there was the Commerce Court by IMP. And that's where the skyline, the storied skyline really begins. And, just bringing it back to the ferry, right? Like, our reluctance to give up the, those cranky old ferries is partly because, that skyline is beautiful and it's constantly changing. Like some of your photographs are already out of date, which is amazing. But I think that one of them that really captures the point that you're making is that picture of that's taken from, I think it's for the Portlands or the east end of the island, of these two chairs, these kind of banged up chairs, looking at the skyline, and it's beautiful. And you know, you go in, it's the city, and it's not beautiful. It's gritty and noisy and whatnot. But from a distance, it's got this great beauty, and I think that that's a success.
What makes it? There's a guy down there who sells hats, and he sells lots of maple leaves hats. So I think that makes it particularly a Toronto. I've not been to very many other cities to be able to kind of talk about how it compares to other places. So that's about the best I can say.
Oh, all right. Yeah. To build on the Ken's last, I think maybe building on that direction. Waterfront Toronto was mentioned a few times, but kind of peripherally. So maybe thinking more explicitly, a bit more about that entity and the impact it's had. And I've lived here for a little over 20 years now. I must say, I think the first few years, I don't remember even going much, which is strange. I mean, they're big waterfront and kind of, you know, so over time, I'm started to appreciate it more. And I'm wondering how much, I mean, like Waterfront Toronto seems to be one of these entities that manages to survive because of its, like it's a tri-level agencies. So you can't mess too much with it. And there's definitely potential in Toronto to mess up with things, whatever they are and so on. So I'm kind of increasingly appreciating just the existence and the role it has. And especially in contrast to basically the rest of most of the city, with few exceptions, just because of the piecemeal processes in most. So anyway, Waterfront, I see it as one of those big exceptions to Toronto in that sense. So just want, like, any thoughts regarding Waterfront Toronto and its role?
Its role is huge and transformative. So the key insight into Waterfront Toronto's existence came from Tony Coombs, the late Tony Coombs, who said that the way to cut through all the fighting between the different landowners and the agencies that, you know, had carved up this space, you know, all the way from the Portlands all the way through the center city, is to create one agency, 3 shareholders, and kind of manage planning from that platform. And then they came up with this, which I think which we don't do very often, which is to begin with the public realm in the planning and to begin with the public consultation. And so that's what Waterfront Toronto did for a long time. They dealt with the regulatory issues, but they said, okay, well, if you create the public realm, then, you know, the development will follow. And I think that that's borne out. And I think that the latest example of that is I apologize, I can't pronounce the name, but the Vidaske, yes. And it can't be said too often that that is a world unique project to rebuild the mouth of a river through a contaminated site like that. It's going to create a great city. That part of the city is going to be amazing. And that's all Waterfront Toronto.
And maybe one more question.
So just one little coda to that. It's also placing design at the center of the process. Design review panel, which is a fundamental part of the project review process, which is, well, you know, the many levels that are not happening in conventional development process.
Okay. Hi. I wanted to make a comment rather than ask a question. Having watched the Portlands development over the last probably 12 years, and having been there quite a lot recently and have been to the new park. And what has struck me about the way that they opened that piece first is it's about families, it's about children, it's about play, and it's about community. And I think a lot can be learned from that when you're designing these projects and thinking about how to take them to the future is families, children, and because they're going to be our future. And also the fact that they aren't doing that with Ontario Place. And I think that the Portlands is just a brilliant piece of work from Waterfront Toronto, and hooray to them.
On that note, oh,
Okay, one last student.
one last one? Okay,
Yes, very, very last one, because it's coming from a student.
let's do it.
Someone said that the development is happening faster than the infrastructure is happening. And in photos like the Gardiner Expressway column, like we already see the infrastructure really like eroding and deteriorating. I was just wondering like what that says for the future of the area, that this infrastructure that's supposedly happening slower is already deteriorating.
The infrastructure that's deteriorating is the Gardiner, which crumbles and has to be repaired in perpetuity. The infrastructure that's not there yet is an LRT line that will go right across the waterfront and all of the associated public space infrastructure that goes with that, bike lanes and so on. And so, you know, we spend a huge amount of money on keeping that Gardiner up. I have changed my views about its role, right? Ken Greenberg over here has done an amazing thing in envisioning what can go on underneath the Gardiner. So I think that those are important insights. But we do spend billions of dollars keeping that piece of concrete going, and in a climate crisis.
It's now owned by the Ontario government. I'm sorry. Just to add a note that the Gardiner is now owned by the Ontario government, part of the deal that was made between the city and the province and the towards the end of the demolition of Ontario Place.
On that note, thank you. Thank you for being on this panel, John, Marco, Stephen, and especially Stephen. Thank you for sharing this incredible work with us. And yeah, it's really amazing. So
And thank you, Elsa, too. Just to say that we invite you to have another look at the photographs in the gallery and mingle with Stephen and everyone else on the panel. And thank you for being here.